Yo, what is up guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. So according to reports on social media, it appears that the relationship between Golden Boy Promotions and Canelo Alvarez have broken down even further with Dazn. According to reports online, Dazn do not see Callum Smith or Billy Joe Saunders as a premier opponents, and they are not interested in those fights happening next. This is quite a big story really, considering that these two guys were in the front running when Canelo was supposed to fight in September. These guys were considered and they were viable opponents then, but for whatever reason, they no longer see these guys as viable opponents. That is the phrase being used on social media. Now, what does that mean? Viable opponents. People are actually jumping to the conclusion that viable opponents mean Dazn saying that Callum Smith and Billy Joe Saunders aren't good enough for that Canelo fight. That's what a lot of people are jumping to the conclusion of. Maybe that is true. Maybe Dazn now want a premier opponent which will drive the subscribers up. Obviously post-pandemic, Dazn would have lost a ton of subscribers. But if that's the case, if they're looking for a premier opponent who's really going to push subscriber numbers up, who does that really leave? Demetrius Andrade? Is that guy's name any bigger than Callum Smith or Billy Joe Saunders? No. Dimitri Bivol? I would love that fight, but is that fight really going to drive subscribers in a big way? Probably not. The only other option for a premier opponent that is really going to drive subscription numbers is a third fight with Gennady Golovkin. I don't really see any other viable option in terms of premier opponent who's going to really increase subscription numbers. Gennady Golovkin really is the only guy. Like I said, if Callum Smith and Billy Joe Saunders aren't good enough, then, Demetrius Andrade is going to fall into that same boat. I would imagine that, John Ryder's going to fall into that same boat. Dimitri Bivol will fall into that same boat. Gennady Golovkin is the only other alternative if they're looking at proper premier opponents. That is the only alternative. Now, when they say Callum Smith and Billy Joe Saunders aren't viable, I'm going to actually hazard a guess, and I'm going to say that they're not talking about the quality of opponent. I'm talking about the price point, the purses that these guys are going to demand for that fight. I don't think they want to shell out that sort of money right now, Obviously, pandemic has hit Dazn hard, they've lost subscribers, but even before that, their management of their finances was quite terrible, overpaying for numerous fighters, paying the likes of Mikey Garcia $7 million to fight Jesse Vargas. I think that whole show cost over $10 million to put on. They never made that money back. Paying Gennady Golovkin $14 million to fight Steve Rolls. Paying Canelo Alvarez $35 million to fight Rocky Fielding. They spent a boatload of money in the past, and in my opinion, they have really blown it up the wall on pointless fights. Fights that nobody really asked for. Fights that really did nothing for their platform. And right now, they're trying to cost cut post-pandemic. If they was a bit more sensible with their finances pre-pandemic, maybe they wouldn't be in this position where they can't even afford to pay someone like Billy Joe Saunders or Callum Smith. There's a lot of talk that Dazn want Canelo to take a pay cut and he's unwilling. That's what it seems like to me. It seems like Dazn are not willing to meet the financial demands of these fighters when in reality they created this market inflation amongst those fighters. And that is the problem with a lot of boxing these days. Inflated purses. We've seen this with the PBC in the past when guys like Leo Santa Cruz, they was getting paid $1 million to fight cab drivers. If you're Leo Santa Cruz and you're going to get paid $1 million to fight a C-level fighter, why would you then actually want to step up and fight somebody like Gary Russell for $2 million? You would just fight 2 cab drivers in the year to make that money up, right? These inflated purses have really dampened the hunger of a lot of fighters, and that is obvious. It's been going on for a long time now. We've seen that with the PBC, we've seen it with Dazn, and also that results in, if something like a pandemic happens or something drastic happens, then because of the amount of money you've spent in the past, negligently, That means now you can't really afford to put on these massive fights. You can't really take the risk to put on these fights due to previous, ill-advised spending on certain fights. I think this whole situation with Dazn purely comes down to money management. I don't think it's Dazn saying Callum Smith and Billy Joe aren't good enough. I think it's Dazn saying that these guys can't afford to pay their wages. Or not so much that they can't afford to pay their wages, they are just unwilling to meet those purses right now due to what's gone on. I think that's the problem here. I think it's Dazn trying to cost cut, trying to tighten their belt, basically obviously due to the pandemic, but also due to their previous, extortionate spending on fights nobody really cared about. They were willing to pay Mikey Garcia $7 million, but they are in doubt whether to pay Juan Francisco Estrada and Roman Gonzalez $1 million apiece to get that fight on. I mean, look at Tevin Farmer. Eddie Hearn and Dazn made Tevin Farmer a multi-millionaire. Tevin Farmer's a decent fighter, but the purses he was getting was extortionate. It's that simple. The biggest purse he had before Dazn was about $90,000 against Billy Dib. That was his highest purse. When he was on Dazn, he was getting paid $750,000 to fight guys like James Tennyson and John O'Carroll. Way above his market value, and it's crazy. And boxing fans always point at MMA and say, well, boxers get paid more, it's a better sport, blah, blah, blah. Bro, fighters in boxing, for the most part, a lot of these guys get overpaid, over their market value, and as a result, it makes these guys soft, playing business politics, playing A side, B side. That's why we see this so much these days. All of these fighters, man, a lot of these fighters are spoilt now. I'm not going to say all of them, because there are some fighters out there who are really still doing it, but for the most part, a lot of these guys are spoilt, and partly that is down to the exorbitant purses that they receive for less than stellar fights, and Dazn are now paying for that in more ways than one. That's what my opinion is on this Canelo Alvarez situation. I don't think it's Dazn saying Billy Joe and Callum Smith aren't good enough. I think it's them saying, listen, if we can't get these fights at a cheaper deal, then we're not going to risk these fights and make them. That's how I see it personally. Anyway, share your thoughts below. What do you make of this story? Peace.